I'm standing in the famous gazebo in Niagara-on-the-Lake, featured in Stephen King's movie adaptation of the 1980s hit movie, The Dead Zone. Across the ditch, as they affectionately call the Niagara River, sits the famous Fort Niagara in Youngstown, New York. We can see its majestic, ominous castle across the way, as they once did in the 1800s. And from all the intricacies within the fort, its long and winding pathways which lead to their own riverbank, they once watched and fired upon the shores of Lake Ontario, where I stand. Welcome to this episode of Historical Niagara, where we are about to embark on 4 of the most famous forts, not only in the Niagara region, but all of Canada, if not North America. Stay tuned. I love Niagara.
I have a question for you. What do you know about Niagara?
It has a really big falls.
I have a question for you. Do you like history?
So let me ask you, is that a rhetorical question?
Niagara, it's more than just the falls. It's rich in history and wine.
Okay, so we were talking about the more obscure places in Niagara. Some of the coolest history is not even in Niagara Falls.
Historical Niagara rocks!
What else do you have to say for yourself?
Good morning, I'm Donald, and I'm all about history.
And I'm all about the base. The base. If you're born, raised, or visit Niagara, you're always from Niagara. One of the greatest places on Earth. Niagara is rich in history, of course, because it was tied to the War of 1812. Sit back, listen to what our experts, that is, the experts on the history of forts, militia, and the War of 1812, and what they have to say about the forts in Niagara.
When you look at Niagara and the history of Niagara, you'll find that there is a significant military presence in Niagara. From the time the Europeans first started settling in this area, forts started to spring up. Old Fort Erie, which is located in Fort Erie on Lake Erie. There's Fort George, located in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and then not far from Fort George, also in Niagara-on-the-Lake, closer to Lake Ontario, you have Fort Mississauga. And right across from there is, on the American side, you have Fort Niagara. So you can see there is a significance relative to the military and the strategic location of those forts in defending the territories along that entire Niagara River.
So we're here in the Gale Family War of 1812 Center. This is where we talk about the War of 1812 in its biggest context, about what it means to the people of living in North America at the time, all the way down to what happened here in Niagara Falls. Where we're standing right now is actually where the Incorporated Militia of Upper Canada were stationed during the Battle of Lundy's Lane. The epicenter was just up the hill at Drummond Hill Cemetery, which is now a National Historic Site. But here in the galleries, we talk about the big and the small stories. We talk about the stories of the militia. We talk about the stories of the Black Pioneers. We talk about the stories of the Indigenous involvement. And we talk about what happened here in Niagara Falls at Chippewa and at Lundy's Lane, and really deal with the aftermath, and that this is a unique place. Niagara Falls and the battles that happen here on Lundy's Lane is in the middle of the city, and it is a very different experience that you experience when you come here. You see at our battlefield, it's not a big pastoral landscape like some of the other battlefields at Niagara Falls. It's right in the heart of the city, and we deal with that and talk about those that aspect of our unique history here in Niagara Falls.
Fort George was constructed in 1796 to essentially act as a counter to the American Fort Niagara, as well as to guard the Niagara River, which was one of the main transportation routes really on the continent. We move on in time, Fort George's importance really increased. It actually became the main headquarters in the Niagara area, or the Centre Division as it was known during the War of 1812. It was actually destroyed by the Americans by artillery fire from the opposite shore, burnt right to the ground, with one exception. Our powder magazine, oddly enough, or ironically enough, actually managed to survive that massive artillery bombardment. And was actually the scene. Once it was destroyed, 2 days later, the Americans attacked, actually along the shores of Lake Ontario. Huge army, 6,000 plus men, and the British had 1,350. Just from that math, you can likely gather what the outcome of that battle would be. And after a very short but nasty firefight, the Americans succeeded in routing the British. And that left the Niagara area, obviously Fort George included, now under the occupation of U.S. forces for the next 7 months. Once the Americans were really forced to abandon their position here in this end of the Niagara area, the British now regained control of this area, captured Fort Niagara, and held this area until the end of the war. So once the British had now control of this area, they continued with the construction that the Americans had started. A much smaller version of the fort. Really, literally, this fort was cut in half and it remained in service really until the 1820s, effectively replaced by both Butler's Barracks as well as Fort Mississauga. And today, over 200 years later, Fort George now serves as a reminder and also to commemorate the War of 1812. And to me, the significance of that conflict is that we were a hair's breadth away from almost ceasing to exist, or almost not being allowed to turn into the country that we know of as Canada today. And myself, as a very proud Canadian citizen, consider that to be extremely significant. Powder magazine, constructed in 1796, therefore making it either the oldest building in the town of Niagara on Lake or certainly very close to that. And the fact that it also survived a massive artillery bombardment, certainly an attestament to its construction and the strength of that construction. We're very lucky to have it. And as far as we know, and I'm willing to certainly bet an awful lot of money on this, is that it is very likely the oldest still standing or surviving military building in the province of Ontario. Certainly other buildings that we have inside of the fort, and these are all open for the public to be able to visit today and certainly have staff in them, is our period kitchen, which operates certainly during the summer months, 7 days a week, where we're actually doing cooking and period baking on the inside of that. We also have the officers' quarters as well, which is the building that we're in right now, which represents certainly the upper crust that was commanding the British Army, and as well as the local militia living here inside of the fort. And of course, we also have the soldiers' barracks here, which gives a very good example of the lifestyle of the soldiers of the period, and certainly the difference between the enlisted ranks versus the commissioned ranks, and also certainly open to the public with staff operating in there 7 days a week as well. Also during the summer months, we have a fairly large team here too. We have a full squad. We also have a fife and drum corps, and depending on what day of the week you come here, we have something going on. We have something going on here every half of an hour. It spans from music performances to theatrical performances to large-scale military shows to friendly and very knowledgeable staff to be able to answer any and all of your questions here at the site. We're very proud of our program here, and we certainly hope that you can have a chance to come and visit us. Okay, so early in the War of 1812, this fort fell under the command of Major General Isaac Brock, and after his unfortunate death at the Battle of Queenston Heights in October of 1812, he was first buried here in one of our bastions, and today that is known as Brock's Bastion. And he spent and I apologize for the term, the first 12 years of his death there before being moved to the first Brock's Monument up at Queenston Heights.
Well, Fort Erie was first established by the British way back in 1764. So it makes it the oldest British Army post in what's now Ontario. And it was built out of the Pontiac uprising, where Pontiac led a fight against the British and their English settlers that was successful for a while. So this little outpost was built here. They built it right on the water's edge. and it kept being wiped out by Lake Erie and Lake Erie ice. So around 1803, a plan was devised to move it, build the posts that people would see today. And that fort was pretty much incomplete when the War of 1812 started, and through the fighting was the scene of the worst fighting to take place on Canadian soil. So in 1814, there was a battle here that lasted for 6 weeks. A series of battles, usually called the Siege of Fort Erie. It's a scene of the worst fighting in Canadian history, because out of almost 15,000 men who served in the 6 weeks of fighting, almost 3,000 became casualties. And then the fort was used for a little bit after the War of 1812, but once the Welland Canal is built, these riverside forts don't have the same importance, and it sort of fell into disrepair. Local kids played in the ruins. They'd have skating parties in the ditches that had flooded over the years. And then by the 20th century, the Parks Commission here had taken over and built a pavilion, and then in the 1930s, a caretaker's quarters, and then they reconstructed the fort in 1939, basically to the way it looked during the War of 1812.
Okay, well, Fort Mississauga is really born, I guess, a phoenix from the flames of the town of Niagara. If you look at the map, the challenge that the British had is to have a direct sort of control over the mouth of the Niagara River. Here's the American Fort Niagara right here, and we didn't have anything on except for an artillery battery on the opposite shore. In 1814, early 1814, when we actually captured Fort Niagara in a surprise night attack, that now allowed us the ability to be able to build a fort on opposite it directly. As you can imagine, it's very challenging to build a fort under the direct range of the guns of your enemy. Once we control Fort Niagara, then you're able to construct freely without any disturbance from your enemy, and it was constructed right here at Point Mississauga, which actually there was a lighthouse there at that point, and Fort Mississauga was built there, and which now, for the rest of the war, gave the British direct and complete control of this mouth of the Niagara River.
So before Fort Mississauga was known as the military fort and what you see today, it was actually Mississauga Point had a lighthouse. And that lighthouse was built in 1804 by the British Army, and it was the first lighthouse on the Great Lakes. This lighthouse had the tower, of course, the actual lighthouse, but also a house where the lighthouse keeper, who was Dominic Henry, kept his family and watched over the lighthouse itself. He and his family became really well known during the War of 1812, mostly his wife in particular, Mary Henry, because during the Battle of Fort George, she came out of the lighthouse and helped soldiers, British or American, who were in need of bandaging or drinks or food throughout the battle while cannonballs are flying over her head. Quite a very courageous woman who really deserves a lot of attention from the War of 1812 as a hero for the British side, of course. And Mary Henry, a lot of those memories and what we know about her came from her daughter Elizabeth Quaid, who was a child that lived in the lighthouse as well. Now, unfortunately, at the end, close to the end of the War of 1812, the lighthouse is torn down. Which is unfortunate because, of course, the sailors on both sides used the lighthouse, but it was torn down so that Fort Mississauga could be built. Now, after it was torn down, the new Fort Mississauga used a lot of the bricks from the lighthouse and used basically, the same location of where the lighthouse was is where the tower of Fort Mississauga is today. Now, Fort Mississauga wasn't just used by the bricks from the lighthouse, it was also used from bricks that are from the town, from various buildings, houses that were torn down when the Major General at the time ordered for everything to be flattened. He didn't want anything to interrupt British sight lines or anywhere for American soldiers to hide. And so a lot of these bricks were taken from the town and brought to build Fort Mississauga, which was done by the Captain Runchie's Colored Corps. Now, this fort, if each of those bricks could talk, the stories that it would have of our community, of whose homes that they came from, it really took everything from our community, and all these stories are wrapped up in this tower that we'll never know about. But a lot of Niagara's early architecture and stuff came from this tower. It's really quite a unique history, that Fort Mississauga, of course. And our museum obviously has a number of items related to Fort Mississauga. We've got photos and plans of the lighthouse, of the fort, when it was used during the Second and First World War. And you know, it's a really important part of our history. It's an important part of the War of 1812 history in our community. A lot of people go to visit it. It's owned by Parks Canada, and they're in the midst of doing a reconstruction of the property. It's a beautiful place. I highly recommend that you go and visit it. You get an amazing view of Lake Ontario, and if you're lucky, a great view of Toronto across the river.
Fort Mississauga, for a couple of reasons, it's just significant. One, it's certainly one of the few, if not the only last remaining star-shaped fort, certainly. The tower is extremely significant because part of it's built from the bricks from the destroyed town of Niagara. But Fort Mississauga's history is not just with the War of 1812. It expands into the Rebellion period, and certainly also goes right into, it was a training ground during World War I. So when we talk about Niagara on the Lake today, the town of Niagara's got a military history that spans from the 1750s right through until the late 20th century, and Fort Mississauga played a huge role in all of that.
Well, Fort Niagara was established by the French in 1726. It wasn't their first attempt to fortify the site. They'd made a couple of efforts in the late 17th century, and those were both failures. But in 1726, they came out here and they built what we call today the French Castle, which was a large stone building. They had gotten permission from the Onondaga Nation to erect a stone house here, but the natives did not want the French to erect a stone fort. So what they did was they designed a very large house that was fortified. So it was really a fort disguised as a chateau. And they held the fort for 33 years until 1759. In that year, it was the 5th year of the 7 Years' War. The British, along with New York provincial troops and native allies, laid siege to the fort in July. They conducted a 19-day siege, very much along European lines. And after holding out for almost 3 weeks, the French were compelled to surrender. So now the post becomes a British fort. And the British hold it until 1796. So they're holding this fort through the period of the American Revolution. And as such, they're using Fort Niagara. First of all, it's their headquarters on the Great Lakes, but they're arming and supplying raiding parties that are striking the frontiers of New York and Pennsylvania. The fort serves as a refuge for loyalists and Native Americans who have been displaced from their homes. And just in general, it's kind of a thorn in the side of the backcountry of New York and Pennsylvania. When the war ends, under the terms of the treaty that ends the American Revolution, the fort is supposed to come to the United States, but Britain holds on to it for an additional 13 years. Finally, in 1796, as a result of the Jay Treaty, the U.S. Takes possession of the fort and holds it until the War of 1812. During that conflict, in December of 1813, British forces launch a daring pre-dawn assault on Fort Niagara. They capture the fort within about 30 minutes, and the fort is again in the hands of Great Britain. They hold it to the end of the War of 1812 and turned back to the U.S. in May of 1815, and it's been in U.S. hands ever since.
So, how well do you know your trivia about the forts in the Niagara region?
After the War of 1812,
The famous Fort Erie was burned to the ground by the Americans. What famous author was one of the first to come and visit its ruins? Was it Mark Twain? Was it the Charles Dickens from A Christmas Carol? How about Edgar Allan Poe? Or was it Samuel Clemens? And the answer is, it was a trick question. It was Mark Twain, who was really Samuel Clemens. Mark Twain was his pen name.
The fort we have today that people can visit, at the center is two big blockhouses, very sturdy, made of stone with copper roofs on both. And really the fort we have here today is the way it would have looked during the fighting. A lot of the other little outbuildings that were being built or planned here for Fort Erie before the War of 1812, they either knocked them over or abandoned building them, actually cut the fort in half, which is what the British did with a lot of their forts in Upper Canada, to give you another layer of defense and to make it easier to defend with the few soldiers you did have. So we have two big blockhouses that have a guard room, barracks, officers' quarters, 3 powder magazines, a surgery, a kitchen, a commissary, a quartermaster, all jammed into these two big sturdy blockhouses that were like forts within a fort.
One of the things about Fort Niagara that's different than many of the frontier forts of early American history is the longevity of its occupation. Most forts only lasted a couple of years and then they were abandoned. But this fort, they kept finding new ways to use it. So when the War of 1812 is over, that's really the last active military conflict that the fort experiences. But they find new ways of using the fort. So they're building a rifle range here in the late 19th century. It's a famous rifle range that troops from all over the United States come in to use. During the First World War, there's a Reserve Officers Training Corps camp here, sending men off to fight in the trenches of Europe. There's a prisoner of war camp here in World War II. And finally, in 1963, the U.S. Army decommissions the post. Now, the old fort was restored between 1929 and 1934. After World War I, the Army moved out of the old fort into a more modern base that existed in what's now Fort Niagara State Park. They moved out of the old fort, and so the buildings began to deteriorate. And that's when the Old Fort Niagara Association was formed. It was a volunteer group that worked with the War Department to restore the old fort and create a museum. So that happened in the mid-1930s. And so today the fort is still a historic site. It's a museum, and we welcome over 200,000 visitors each year.
So the Battle of Lundy's Lane was a huge battle. And what was happening during 1814 was that the Americans had taken Fort Erie, had started moving up the peninsula and starting dominating this area. The British had retreated back to Fort George and were sort of holding on strong as much as they could. But really both sides were going back and forth across the region in order to try and conquer this space. But what happened on July 25th of 1814 is that the Americans started another incursion into the northern area of the Niagara Peninsula. Started moving up from Fort Erie. We hear alarm bells were going quite early, and the British decided to take a stand at the highest point in Niagara Falls, right at the top of Lundy's Lane. And so the Americans came in. We understand that they came through the bushes and through the trees and started flanking and providing a front in front of the British. The British had cannons at the top of the hill and really held the position quite well. But the American forces were just too strong. They kept on sending waves and waves of people at them through what at the time was a cemetery, and it is still today. There was a small meeting house and there was a clearing that they were able to go. But we hear stories of them going over fences, split rail fences, through the dense tree bush, and coming out and finally overtaking the British. And so the British got pushed back off the mountain, off the hill, and the Americans spun the cannons around and started firing back at the British. And so the British kept on sending wave and wave after the Americans on the hill. Finally, when the morning came, the Americans had stretched themselves far too far. They were tired, they were weak, they were hungry, and they were thirsty. And so the Americans felt that they could not hold on to the top of Lundy's Lane anymore, decided to retreat back and reinforce themselves. The British then came back onto the battlefield, took their cannons back, and were prepared for the next battle.
The Siege of Fort Erie really fits into the last big campaign year of the War of 1812. So in 1814, the Americans land here with a pretty good army, quickly overwhelm the little garrison of Fort Erie, and then they march north. They captured this place July 3rd. On the 4th of July, they celebrated their national birthday. And on July 5th, fought the British and the Canadians and native warriors at the Battle of Chippewa. And the Americans are successful. They pushed the British forces all the way to Fort George in Niagara Lake. They use McFarland House, which you can also visit today as their headquarters. But the US Navy doesn't show up, the British don't surrender, and the Americans have to withdraw back past Queenston and past the falls. And then the British follow them, and eventually we have the Battle of Lundy's Lane on July 25th. It's a big brawl, almost 1,900 casualties in a vicious night battle. The Americans actually hold the hill, what we call Drummond Hill, in Niagara Falls, but they've taken too many casualties, and they withdraw all the way back here to Fort Erie. The British follow, and again, from August 3rd to September 17th, they bash away at each other for 6 solid weeks of fighting with almost 3,000 casualties.
Behind me is the fort's War of 1812 flag. This was the original flag that flew over the outpost. The British captured the fort in 1813. They took the flag. It ended up in a castle in Scotland as a trophy of war. And we bought it back in the 1990s, and so today the original flag is on display here at our visitor center. Well, Ernst Wille was a German prisoner of war here from 1944 to 1945. When they found out that he was an artist, they commissioned him to paint a mural on the wall of the Officers Club out in what we call New Fort Niagara. And at this time we have a special exhibit of his other artwork here in our visitor center. One of the most intriguing pieces is a painting he did of Normandy Beach 2 days before the invasion. He had painted this painting of a very peaceful beach scene, rolled it up, sent it home to his parents, and 2 days later he was captured by the invading Allies. So we have the painting showing this bucolic scene on display.
Well, the fort is usually open from Mother's Day weekend right through till Halloween, and it's open 7 days a week, and visitors are invited to tour on their own. We'll give you a map and you can check out the fort. There's demonstrations and displays and cooking and a surgery and a place where you can dress up. And there's muskets and cannons going off. We also play host to a lot of reenactments. So this coming summer we're going to have a Fenian Raid reenactment. The largest Fenian raid into Canada took place in Fort Erie, June 1866. We are going to have our big August blowout when we reenact the Siege of Fort Erie. That's the largest annual reenactment in Canada. And also at the end of August, we're going to have some friends come from North America and even from Europe to do a little Napoleonic reenactment here, because to some people the War of 1812 was a part of a bigger conflict that went on worldwide. So there's lots of activities going on in and around the fort through the summer and fall.
If you'd like to learn more about Fort Mississauga or the lighthouse that existed before, feel free to come down and visit us at the Niagara-on-the-Lake Museum on 43 Castlereagh Street in Niagara-on-the-Lake. We have currently in our permanent display a section on the War of 1812 where you can learn more about the Fort Mississauga, why it was built, and its future later on. As well, we have on display currently one of the original gunpowder magazine keys that was actually one of the very first pieces that came into the museum's collection. If you're interested in doing research, we have a number of photographs and plans and postcards and such that really show great images of Fort Mississauga throughout the years. And even during the war, the First World War and the Second World War, when it was Niagara Camp, I welcome you to come down. We're free in February for anyone to come in and visit and check out the exhibits.
So folks, there you have it. 4 forts in the Niagara region. If you were ever in the area, definitely check them out and grab and taste a piece of the history of the War of 1812. Bringing the Niagara history to the world. See you next time. I have a question for you. Do you love history? If so, do you love Niagara Falls? It's time to check out one of the greatest museums in Canada.
I'm Clark Burnett from the City of Niagara Falls Museums. Right now I'm standing in the Gale Family War of 1812 gallery. Behind me is a wonderful backdrop of Niagara Falls, and that's what we do here. We talk about the wonderful history of Niagara Falls. So the War of 1812, we're standing on the battlefield, the Battle of Lundy's Lane here. The Lincoln Militia were positioned right here during the battle itself, and we're on historic property around the Main and Ferry area. When people come here, they come and visit this gallery, and they can also see the rest of the Niagara Falls story. We tell all the many different stories that are unique to the community and what we do here in the City of Niagara Falls. You'll learn about tourism, you'll learn about hydro generation, you'll learn about the firefighters and the military people that fought here. And then in our temporary gallery, we do lots of different things throughout the year. Next coming up is World War Women, we've done electricity, we got hockey in the summertime, and lots of other things to let you sort of understand the history of Niagara Falls, the history of the world, and the history of Canada. Come to the Niagara Falls History Museum and get your hands-on history.